Well, thank you for inviting me here. Thank you for the welcome. Indeed, I'm always glad to come back to the home turf in Donegal. Any good reason I'll be here. I've been followed here by two from my locality up in near Ballymoney, Derfa country, as they call it. Two folk who come all the way. So there you are. I'm greatly honoured altogether. Plus, Carol, my wife, of course, is here too. So I'm going to give you a short talk about Patrick, and especially the theme I want to talk about is how Patrick, the slave, became a saint. How did he become a saint? I'm not giving you all the details of Patrick. That would take quite a long time. If you want to read more, let me start by recommending a few books. First of all, this one is generally available, I think, second-hand. Anyway, I don't know if it's available new. It's called The Real St. Patrick, and it's quite a short presentation. But the great advantage of it is that it has Patrick in his own words at the end. One of the things that he wrote was his confession, or his confessio in Latin, but this is in English, and it's at the back of this book. So if you want to read Patrick in his own words, this book, The Real St. Patrick, is very useful. And then this book also has quite a bit on him, on Patrick. It's more general. It's The Rise and Fall of Christian Ireland by a leading historian, Crawford Gribben. And I do know him, and he certainly is a leading historian. And if you want a really scholarly account of Patrick and early Christian Ireland and Christianity in Ireland throughout the centuries, then this is very, very well written, very clear, very helpful. The Rise and Fall of Christian Ireland by Crawford Gribben. Again, I think it'll be available second-hand on the internet, or you might be able to get it new as well. There'll be another book I'll be referring to, but and not mentioned at this stage anyway. So my theme this evening is how Patrick, the slave, became a saint. Well, I suppose you would agree. There's no doubt about the importance of Patrick in the history of Ireland. Let me give you two simple proofs of this. First of all, think of the number of people who bear the name of Patrick in one form or another. I don't know if there's anyone here this evening who's called Patrick. Maybe not, but there's every possibility there could be, because Patrick is an extremely popular name. Patricia, a female form, Porrick, Podge, Pat. There's so many variations of the name. And Paddy, of course, is another name. So that's one evidence that Patrick is very, very important in Ireland. And the second one, of course, again, an obvious one, is the national holiday, soon approaching, is the 17th of March, reputed to be the day in which Patrick died many, many centuries ago. So those two things in themselves, I think, tell us Patrick is of great importance in the history of Ireland, and it's important we know about him. I'll be telling you three main things about Patrick in relation to this question about how he became a saint. But I want to start by saying, and you might be surprised about this, but anyway, here it is. There are a lot of things we don't know about Patrick. We don't know for sure. There's speculation, there's legend, there's myth, but are they really true? There's lots of them. We have to realise that when we're thinking about Patrick, we're going back to the late 4th century. The late 4th century. That's not today nor yesterday, as they say. That's a long way back. And the late 4th or early 5th century, possibly, we don't have much surviving historical evidence when you go back that far, especially given all the wars and upheavals in Irish history. A lot of it's disappeared. And also there wasn't that much literacy way back then either. There wasn't that much put in writing. So there's not that much that's there, not that much evidence. And that's a problem for us to know what Patrick was really all about. The earliest biography of Patrick was written some 200 years after his death. That's quite a long time period. Can you imagine that? That the earliest written record we have of Patrick, a biography, is 200 years, written by a man named Murrahu. So again, its reliability then is open to question, especially as it seems to contain some very strange and legendary tales about Patrick I might be mentioning later on. So there are a lot of things we can't be sure about. I want to mention a few things about Patrick that are maybe believed by many people, but may not be at all true, hardly likely to be true. First of all, here's one, I'm sure you've all heard this. Patrick banished the snakes from Ireland. You've heard that one. Patrick banished the snakes from Ireland. Well, there's no evidence whatsoever that there ever were snakes in Ireland. Ireland's cold and damp climate, like tonight, wouldn't be very favourable to the snakes. Possibly this story is derived from the fact that Patrick may have preached against a false religion that involved the worship of images of a snake or images of a serpent. That was quite common in ancient Ireland. People would be worshipping things like images of snakes. So it may well be that the idea of Patrick banishing the snakes from Ireland is really referring to the fact that he spread the message of Christianity, and this false worship of the serpent was done away with or lessened anyway. That's the first thing. The second thing that we certainly can't be sure about and is doubtful, that Patrick wore the colour green. Now, St. Patrick's Day, there's some green here tonight, but St. Patrick's Day, people dress up in green. They even have, our girls when they were smaller, and even still today, like the McDonald's green-coloured milkshake. Have you had it, I wonder? On St. Patrick's Day, there's a big demand for it because green is the colour associated with St. Patrick. But there's no evidence that Patrick himself favoured the colour green. We have no evidence of it. The colour green has probably become associated with Patrick because in the 19th century, it became the colour which Irish nationalism promoted as an emblem of Ireland. That's a very suitable emblem. We live in a very green land. If you ever go to Spain or some of these other places where there's lots of sunshine and not much rain, one of the things you notice, first of all, is how brown everything is. Whereas in Ireland, there are indeed 40 shades of green. But there's no proof that Patrick ever wore green or it was his favourite colour. The third thing that's probably not true, I think it's not true about Patrick, is that Patrick sought to persuade God to grant his prayer that no Saxon or no Englishman would ever live in Ireland. Well, did Patrick ever pray such a prayer? Highly unlikely, because shocking as it may seem, the evidence would suggest that Patrick himself came from Britain. He came from the British mainland. We'll discuss where later on. So it's highly unlikely that Patrick himself would ever have prayed such a prayer. May the English never be in Ireland. May the Saxons never be in Ireland. So that's another one. Fourthly, it's not true either that Patrick was by himself responsible for bringing the Christian message to Ireland. It wasn't a one-man show. And there is evidence even that there was Christianity in Ireland before Patrick came. We don't know who they were. They're very often in history. Some of the greatest things are done by people whose names we don't know. They fade into the past and they leave no trace. And it's very likely that the Christian message was first brought to Ireland possibly by traders. There was a lot of sea trade. Most of the trade was done by sea. And it's very possible then that sea traders came, and as they did their trade, they also told people about the Christian message. And that's often put down as the most likely reason. Patrick, of course, was very, very important, but he wasn't the only one, and he probably wasn't the first one to bring Christianity to Ireland. So those are some things that are, I think, extremely doubtful, probably not true. Then some things about which we are unsure. That's a lot of speculation about. First of all, when was he born? When was Patrick born? Well, we don't have his birth certificate, and we don't even have a record near the time telling us when exactly he was born. There's no definite date given in the ancient annals. The best estimate is the late 4th century, probably around 390 AD or 395 AD. Although some scholars have argued it was a good bit later than that. It was into the next century. So there's no certainty about the date of his birth. Secondly, where was he born? Where was he born? Well, we can say he wasn't born in Ireland anyway. He wasn't a native of Ireland, of the island of Ireland. And there have been lots of suggestions made. Here is a history book. This is a leading academic history book of the period by John R. Walsh and Thomas Bradley. A history of the Irish Church from 400 to 700 AD. They discuss the question, where was Patrick born? In his writings, he only mentions one place as being his locality. And you might think, oh, well, then we know. The name in Latin is Banavem Tabernae. Okay, Banavem Tabernae. Oh, right, okay. He mentions this. The problem is no ancient map contains this name. It wasn't a very big place. It wasn't a very important place. A wee small village, but like Convoy maybe. No Convoy's on the map. But in the ancient maps, they only showed the major centres, and so Banavan Tavernae, to date anyway, so far, has never been found. And therefore, scholars make all kinds of suggestions as to where Patrick was born. Here are some of them. I'll give you a list here from this person's writing. It says, countless scholars have written, even in recent years, about Patrick's life and character and mission. And all kinds of theories, elaborate theories, have been composed about where he was born. Some have attempted to identify his locality with Boulogne. Do you know where Boulogne is? In northeastern France. So some scholars have in the past said he was actually from France. However, that theory, I think, isn't so popular nowadays. Others have opted for, and you can see why this might be the case, a place called Kilpatrick near Dumbarton in Scotland. So he came from Kilpatrick, and the Kill in Irish or Scotch Gaelic means church, the Church of Patrick. You can see why but that could have been named much later on and mightn't have been his locality at all. No proof of that. Others have suggested Glastonbury in Somersetshire. Glastonbury, famous for the Wild Music Festival. Maybe some of you have been there. I wouldn't go near it. For starters, covered in mud. I don't like mud, quite apart from the music. But anyway, Glastonbury is another one. Another suggestion is a place called Tafarn on the island of Anglesey off the northwest coast of Wales. That's another suggestion. But basically, this is all speculation. This is all guesswork. The best thing we can say is it was probably somewhere in Britain to which Irish pirates would have had access. Because as you might know, Patrick's life story really begins with him being carried off from his home area by Irish pirates and brought to Ireland. So somewhere accessible, somewhere in Britain probably accessible to the Irish pirates. So it wouldn't be very far inland. But we don't really know. So again, his place of birth, we can't be sure. Thirdly, we can't be sure about this. Did Patrick use the shamrock to explain the great truth of the Trinity? God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, one God. Did he use it? Well, again, no reference to that in his own writings. It's much later on it becomes associated with Patrick. So there's no clear evidence that he actually did that. Not impossible, but no clear evidence. Fourthly, did Patrick actually compose the hymn known as the breastplate of St. Patrick? Maybe you're familiar with it. Let me quote you a bit. I arise today through God's strength to pilot me, God's might to uphold me, God's wisdom to guide me, God's eyes to look before me, God's ears to hear me, God's word to speak to me, God's hands to guard me, God's shield to protect me, God's host to save me from snares of devils, from temptation of vices, from everyone who shall wish me ill, far and near. That is known as a section of the breastplate of St. Patrick. However, the evidence, if you like, the evidence from the language of it itself would suggest it was composed much after the time of Patrick, probably by someone whose name we don't know, but it wasn't unusual for something that was written to be attributed to a more famous person, and Patrick certainly was famous. So again, it seems unlikely that this was a composition of Patrick. Well, so far I've told you what we don't know. And you're saying, well, what's the point of all that? let me come now to three important things that we do know about Patrick. Three important things. And this has to do with, again, Patrick, how he became a saint. I have a handout here, about 20 of them, I think. I better keep one for myself. Just to illustrate this, would you pass them around, please? Thank you. Should be about 20 copies there, so there should be nearly enough. These are some quotations from Patrick's own writings that we'll come into. I'll just wait for a moment till they're distributed. Okay, I have there three quotations which are going to sum up also three main headings of this talk. And these quotations are taken from two writings which scholars generally accept are genuinely by Patrick. So the best way to know what Patrick was all about is to go to his own writings which have survived. And two of them have survived. They are known as his Confession, or his Confessio in Latin, and his letter to the soldiers of Coroticus. Now, I'm not going to look at that tonight, the second one take too long, but just to explain, the letter to the soldiers of Coroticus was a letter that he wrote to a pagan king who had taken into captivity some of the Christian converts. And Patrick warns him, if he doesn't mend his ways and if he doesn't repent, the judgment of God will come upon him because of his cruelty and his misbehavior. So that's what the letter to the soldiers of Coroticus is about. But the much better known one, the one contained in the back of this little book, is Patrick's Confession. And it is really a defense of his life and ministry, because some false accusations have been made against Patrick by a former friend who betrayed him and who made false accusations against him. So the main reason why Patrick wrote his confession was to defend himself against false charges brought against him. And in doing so, he describes his background, he describes how he came to Ireland, and he describes the mission that he carried out in Ireland as well. So these are the two sources. And we're going to look mainly at the confession and some quotations from it to answer the question, how did Patrick the slave become a saint? The first point, he did come to Ireland as a slave. He didn't come to on a wee tourist trip. Not many people would have had time for leisure of tourism in those days. He didn't come as a trader. He actually came involuntarily in the first place as a slave. It seems that Patrick, from his own description, came from quite a well-to-do background. One might indeed say that he was upper class in his background. One of the things he tells us in his confession was that his father had an estate and a villa. So that was quite well off. Also, in the letter to Coroticus, he writes, I was a free man, a freeborn man, according to the flesh. I was the son of a decurion. A decurion was a kind of local official, a local kind of almost a magistrate or official. So again, quite a significant figure. Also, his father, whose name he gives us, Calpurnius, was a deacon in the local church. So therefore, Patrick seems to have come from some kind of Christian background. He himself seems to have come from a family that experienced Christianity to some degree or another anyway. So he didn't come from a completely pagan background. He came from some kind of Christian background. But Patrick's privileged existence, imagine this happening here. Anybody here about 16 years of age? There's one anyway. Well, imagine this. Can you imagine this happening? Or even if you were 17 or 18. His privileged existence was turned upside down when at about the age of 16, a party of Irish slave traders raided his father's estate, killed many of the servants, and they carried off young Patrick as a slave to some part of Ireland. Imagine that. Been snatched from your home, snatched from your family, and carried off and taken to a land and a place you knew nothing about as a slave. A slave? How traumatic that would be. Now, here's an interesting question. Where in Ireland was he taken as a slave? Anyone know? It's quite well known in many ways. Anyone dare to have a guess where it said he was a slave? Some are up near your folk, actually, yes, up your part of the world there. One of the places is Slemish, yes, Slemish. I'm intending to climb it sometime, but I haven't got round to it yet. I better do it soon, or I mightn't be able. But Slemish in County Antrim. Certainly one of the accounts has him herding sheep there, looking after shepherding sheep, a shepherd boy on Slemish in County Antrim. But then another strand of evidence, which seems equally strong, associates him with, and here again you can tell from the name, a mountain in County Mayo, Patrick, that people still climb today in pilgrimages. Now, there's much debate. Now, it's possible that he was in both of these places. He could have been sold. Slaves were sold. He could have been sold by one master to another. So he could have been in both places. We just can't be entirely sure. He mentions the Western Sea, which would seem to imply it was more likely that he was over there, County Mayo, near Patrick. But he could have been in Slemish. I don't want to totally dismiss that. But imagine the trauma of being so suddenly and violently snatched away from the comforts of your home and made a slave at such a young age. Patrick writes himself. He writes the following. I was taken into captivity to Ireland with many thousands of people. So there were a lot of slave trading going on. It went both ways. The Irish were taking slaves from the British mainland, and the British were taking slaves from Ireland. It was a big trade then, and a very cruel trade. He also writes the following. As a youth, nay, almost a boy, I was taken captive before I knew what to pursue and what to avoid. He also writes, but after I came to Ireland, every day I had to tend sheep. So this seems to have been the main job he did as a slave. He had to tend sheep on behalf of his master or masters. How long was he a slave here in Ireland? How long did this ordeal go on? Well, we don't know precisely, but reading between the lines, we can estimate at least 6 years, probably 6 years he spent as a slave here in Ireland. And then somehow or other, he managed to escape. Slaves often did try to run away. Most of them didn't get away, but he managed to escape, and he got a ship. And after a very torturous sea journey, he eventually managed to get back to his own family. So quite remarkable, really. That wouldn't have been too common. So that's the first thing about Patrick. Patrick first came to Ireland as a slave. Secondly, when he was in Ireland as a slave, that's when he became a saint. And by saint here, I mean, the word saint simply means someone set apart to serve God, someone who truly knows and loves God and is set apart by God to be his servant. So anyone at all who believes in Jesus Christ is actually a saint. We sometimes think of saints just as very super holy people. Now, you should be holy, but a saint is an ordinary Christian set apart by God. So when did this happen to Patrick? Well, when he was in Ireland, a number of crucial events happened. Number one, it involved, first of all, him coming to have a sense of his own guilt and need for forgiveness. The most famous words, if you look at the sheet I gave you, the most famous words that Patrick wrote are in the opening line of his confession, in Latin, of course, originally. But he introduces himself in this way. Here's how he introduces himself. He doesn't say, I am Patrick, a great hero. He says, I am Patrick, a sinner. A sinner. That's how he identifies himself at the beginning of his writings. He is a sinner. He's someone who's aware that he's broken God's law and is guilty before God. In fact, he even came to see the experience of captivity as an event that God had graciously used to humble him and to cause him to seek after a relationship with God. Speaking of himself, if you look at the sheet again, and others been taken into captivity, he admits, quote, and deservedly so. He isn't feeling sorry for himself. He says, we deserved it, and deservedly so, because we turned away from God and did not keep his commandments. So he sees this being brought here as a slave as a way of humbling him and making him aware of his need to turn to God. So that's the first part of it. He describes his conversion to Christianity in the following way. Here's how he describes it. And then the Lord opened the sense of my unbelief, that I might at last remember my sins and be converted with all my heart to the Lord my God. It's a very deep experience here of conversion, because he says, converted with all my heart to the Lord my God. And once more, and very vividly, drawing on the language of Psalm number 40, he writes this: thus, at least, I know most certainly, before I was humiliated, I was like a stone lying in the deep mire, or deep mud. And he that is mighty came, and in his mercy lifted me up, and raised me aloft, and placed me on top of the wall. Isn't that a very interesting picture of being in the mud, unable to help yourself, and God in his mercy comes and lifts him up and places his feet upon a wall or upon a rock? We can also see from this, Patrick knew that his conversion was due to the grace or the mercy of God. He didn't deserve it. He didn't earn it. He could never have lifted himself out of his own deep mire that he was in. Here's something else he writes about this. He attributes his conversion to the free gift of God. He writes, hence I cannot be silent, nor indeed is it expedient, about the great benefits and the great grace which the Lord has chosen to bestow upon me in the land of my captivity. He talks about the great benefits, the great grace that the Lord chose to bestow upon him. Patrick, you see, didn't make himself into a saint. Nobody can do that. He became a saint as a result of the mercy and the grace of God toward him. And again, his conversion was centered on faith in Jesus Christ. He came to see it as a sinner. He could only have forgiveness by trusting in what Jesus had done for him on the cross. Let me quote two examples of this. He contrasts the false worship of the sun. There was a lot of sun worship in ancient pagan Ireland. One of the things that people worshipped. They didn't know the true creator God, so they looked up to the sun and they worshipped the sun. And Patrick writes this: he contrasts the false worship of the sun practiced by so many in pagan Ireland with his faith in Jesus. Here's what he writes: for this sun, which we see, rises daily for us because he commands it so. But it will never reign, nor will its splendor last. What is more, those wretches who adore it will be miserably punished. Not so we who believe and worship the true Son, S-O-N, the Son of God. Not so we who believe and worship the true Son, Christ, who will never perish. So you see the sharp contrast he draws there between the worship of the Son and the worship of Jesus as the Son of God. Secondly, also, referring to his later call to come to Ireland, he writes, or he hears this voice which says to him this: he that laid down his life for thee, it is he that speaketh in thee. And so I awoke full of joy. The message came to him about Jesus laying down his life for him, and he says, I awoke. He awoke from the dream or the vision full of joy. So he was in Ireland, and while he was in Ireland, he came to know Jesus, set aside to serve the Lord. And then the third main point, he came back to Ireland, eager that many others might become Christians or might become saints, one and the same thing. The term saints is used in the Bible to describe every true Christian, not just well-known individuals like Patrick. The word in the Bible simply means one set apart to serve God. Now, why did Patrick come back? Well, the time period between Patrick's escape and his return to Ireland, again, isn't certain. It would appear likely he spent quite a few years receiving theological training. And again, the scholars disagree as to where he received this theological training. Some would say he received all of it in Britain, in his home area, or near his home area. But others, and I think probably rightly, strongly argue that you can detect in his Latin continental influences, and he may well therefore have spent time on the continent receiving theological training. But why was Patrick so willing to come back to the land where he had been a slave? Can you imagine now, You wouldn't have maybe happy memories, would you, of a place where you'd been a slave? Naturally speaking, one might have thought it was the very last place you'd ever want to go. Why go back there, where I had such a rough time as a slave? His family, who are so glad to have him back, certainly didn't want him to go. He writes this: I was in Britain with my people, who received me as their son, and sincerely besought me that now at last, having suffered so many hardships, I should not leave them and go elsewhere. Understandably, his family, you've been taken off as a slave many years. Well, why would you go back? His family want him to stay with them. Understandable. But Patrick is compelled to go, as we'll see. Why? Why is he compelled to go? Well, he received a definite summons or call from God to do so. It was by means of a vision. He heard words such as these: We ask thee, boy, come and walk among us once more. The vision was of somebody from Ireland. We ask thee, boy, come and walk among us once more. And he admits, I didn't go to Ireland of my own accord. He felt compelled to go by a summons or a call from God. Also, it's clear he was aware of the command given by the Lord to his disciples to be a fisher of men. He says, we ought to fish well and diligently, as the Lord exhorts and teaches, saying, come ye after me, and I will make you to be fishers of men. Another reason why he felt compelled to come to Ireland to tell people about Christianity is this: he was convinced the day of judgment might be about to arrive. He writes, for example, and so I should dread exceedingly with fear and trembling the sentence on that day, when no one will be able to escape or hide, but we all, without exception, shall have to give an account even of our smallest sins before the judgment seat of Christ. Patrick was aware there were many in Ireland who knew nothing of forgiveness, who knew nothing of Christianity, and who were in danger, therefore, in grave danger of their souls. And this compelled him. And even more than that, there was something else. This awareness of judgment was heightened by Patrick's belief, wrong though it was, but he had this belief, that in coming to Ireland, he'd reached the end of the earth. And therefore the end must be near. He writes, thus imitating somehow those who, as the Lord once foretold, would preach his gospel as a testimony to all nations before the end of the world, so we have seen it, so it has been fulfilled. Indeed, we are witnesses that the gospel has been preached unto those parts beyond which there lives nobody. So Patrick thought he had reached the very end of the world. Of course, he wasn't aware, as we are aware, that there was a whole world out to the west. But Patrick thought, I've reached the ends of the earth. And the Bible says, when the gospel is being preached to the ends of the earth, then the end will come. This made Patrick all the keener to preach the gospel, even though he was mistaken about the geography. I want to mention then 3 other aspects of his missionary work that are really admirable, that are very challenging. First of all, the hardships that Patrick was willing to endure. Do you think it was easy for Patrick to go about telling people about Christianity in pagan Ireland, where there were people called the Druids? They were the leaders of paganism, and they were very opposed to Christianity. And he tells us in his writings he had many accidents. There were no motorways in ancient Ireland. We're told indeed that ancient Ireland was very, very much covered by forests. A lot of them were later cut down to supply the British Navy. But in ancient Ireland, bad roads, just muck pathways, very poor roads, very dangerous for travelling. And he had to endure many accidents. He says, many attempts to kill him, plots against him, false accusations even made against him by a close friend. And I think I have this quote there in your sheet. He writes, I testify in truth and in joy of heart before God and his holy angels that I never had any reason except the gospel and its promises why I should ever return to the people from whom once before I had barely escaped. He was willing to endure the hardships because he wanted to make the good news of the gospel known to people who badly needed to hear it. So there were the hardships. Then secondly, undoubtedly, the success of his mission. Many people becoming saints or Christians as a result of his ministry. On more than one occasion, Patrick in his writings refers to having baptized, quote, many thousands. Many thousands. Now, I don't know what the population of Ireland was way back then. It wouldn't have been very large. It wouldn't have been anywhere near the 8 million it had reached on the eve of the famine in 1845. Might have been 1 million, I don't know, but it wouldn't have been a huge number. And he says he baptized many thousands. Also, he says, quote, hence, how did it come to pass in Ireland that those who never had a knowledge of God, but until now had always worshipped idols and things impure, have now been made a people of the Lord? People in Ireland, he says, have now been made a people of the Lord. And that doesn't mean that every Irish person was converted to Christianity. Even after Patrick's time, there were still many pagans in Ireland. But undoubtedly, Patrick's mission was greatly blessed by God. Many people professed Christianity. And the third thing about his mission, he always gave God the credit for the success of his mission. He always gave thanks to God for it. There was no proud boasting on Patrick's part. He never suggested it was because of his own brilliance as a preacher, his own eloquence, that people had become believers. Rather, here's what he writes. I pray those who believe and fear God, whoever chooses to look at or receive this writing from Patrick, which Patrick, a sinner, unlearned, has composed in Ireland, that no one should ever say, it was my ignorance, if ever did or showed anything however small, according to God's good pleasure. But let this be your conclusion, and let it be thought that as is the perfect truth, it was the gift of God. Patrick says, all that has been achieved in this mission is the gift of God, the gracious gift of a merciful God. How typical of Patrick. What a good example. As one who saw even his slavery as a gift to God used to humble him. As one who testified that his becoming a saint was due to the grace and mercy of God. And as one who saw, therefore, also the success of his mission as being a gift from the mercy and grace of God. Just want to say one more thing. I think the best way to sum up Patrick's life and mission is to refer to the words that he alludes to from Psalm number 40. He uses them to describe his conversion, and I want to give them to you now in closing in the poetical or metrical version, which I learnt as a child and used to sing in convoy churches up the road, Psalm 40. Here are the words, and Patrick, if you like, quotes these or alludes to them in his writings. And by the way, the book of the Bible that Patrick quotes most often in his writings is the book of Psalms. The Psalms were sung very widely in early Christian Ireland. They were the main form of praise in early Christian Ireland, not just in Patrick, but evidence from others as well. But Psalm 40 was especially meaningful to Patrick. Here's the poetical rendering of what happened to Patrick. Speaking of the Lord, he took me from a fearful pit and from the miry clay, and on a rock he set my feet, establishing my way. That's what God can still do for anybody, for any of us here this evening. No matter how deep down we may be in the mud, as it were, no matter how messy our lives may be, he can take us, just as he took Patrick, out of the miry clay, and he can set our feet upon the rock that is Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the Saviour of all who repent and who believe in him. Well, that's, I think, all I want to say. If you want just one more thing, a far more scholarly presentation of Patrick, you want to read some of the controversy and the debate about him, there is an online resource called the Dictionary of Irish Biography. It gives a biography of nearly every famous person who has ever lived or worked in Ireland. And there's a great article on Patrick, and it runs to about 8 or 9 pages. So if you want to get a really in-depth discussion of things about Patrick, you'll find it in the Dictionary of Irish Biography online. I think it's still accessible online. You have to pay for most of the entries, but I think Patrick is so well known, they allow you to look it up for free. At least the last time I looked up, it was there anyway. But even if you don't read that, remember the words of Psalm 40, because I think they sum up the essence of what happened to Patrick. He took me from a fearful pit, and from the miry clay, and on a rock he set my feet, establishing my way. Thank you. I'll take some questions, maybe. Is that all right, Stephen? If anyone has any, I'll try to answer. But just be aware, so many things about Patrick we can't be sure about. So I may well answer, can't be sure about that. Anyone got any curiosity, any questions?
What language would he have spoken and that he came from Britain?
Yes.
Was it the same language here at that stage?
Ah. Well, Patrick, I think what's clear from his writings is he regards himself not only as British, but he regards himself as Roman. There's some references in his writings. In other words, he was influenced by Roman culture, and therefore almost certainly the language that he had grown up with would be Latin. And Latin was the language of learning as well. Whether he had another more localized dialect, we don't know. All we know is he wrote in Latin, and Latin would have been known in Ireland among the small number of better educated people, but wouldn't have been widely known at all. So even the issue of how did he communicate is an interesting one. How did Patrick communicate? It's a difficult one to know how exactly, but Latin was, I think, his own main language. It was a language of theology as well. He had been trained in Latin. He writes in Latin, and almost certainly he spoke in Latin. But he may have had other dialects as well. We just don't know. We don't know. Did he speak in Gaelic, in ancient Irish? I don't know. Probably unlikely that he could have done that himself, but we don't know. Thank you. That's a good question to which I don't have a clear answer.
I think a lot of people associate Patrick more with Roman Catholic side of Ireland.
Well, I think it's tied up with how in the 19th century Patrick became a kind of, emblem for Ireland, and therefore, but he was looked upon favourably as well by all kinds of denominations. Everyone wants to claim him. Actually, in the 19th century, there were several scholars who said, "Oh no, Patrick wasn't a Catholic. Patrick was the Church of Ireland." I've read articles which claim, "Oh no, Patrick was a Seventh-day Adventist," because there's some evidence that Saturday was the day that was being observed in Celtic Ireland for a long time as a special day. So we can't really put him into a box. We can't say he belonged to this denomination or another. That would be, I say, sort of putting the timeline out of zinc. He was, I believe, a truly Bible-believing Christian. That's the best way to describe him, because if you read his confession, most of it is actually made up of quotations from the Bible, Book of Psalms, Book of Romans, Book of Acts, some of the Gospels. So he is deeply embedded in the Bible. So I would describe him as a Bible-believing Christian, and I wouldn't certainly claim he was a Reformed Presbyterian, even though he loved the Psalms, as Reformed Presbyterians love the Psalms. Anyone else? Yes.
Yeah, would he have been Augustine would have been the other
Yes.
great writer at the time of his confession?
That's right.
Would you find that in the confession that he was influenced by Augustine's writings?
Well, certainly his theology of grace, salvation as a free gift from God, salvation by grace, is perfectly in line with Augustinian theology, yes. So possibly. Again, we don't know where Patrick received his theological education, but he may well have, that strand certainly of theological truth is very much in line with Patrick's understanding of Christianity. So you could say he was Augustinian in his understanding of salvation by grace. It's not by works, not what we do. It's a free gift available to all who will accept it by faith. So yes, certainly in line with Augustinian theology, how much he was influenced by it. Probably you get Augustinian theology from the Bible. You may have got it from the Bible. I don't know for sure. But yeah, that's a good question. Anyone else? I want to tell you one or two more things, just because you'll come across them. Some of the earliest writings of Patrick distort him. They portray him as a kind of superhero, a kind of pagan superhero. A number of stories, for example, and these are people admired Patrick greatly, so they told exaggerated stories about him, about what he could do. One of the stories is that he had an enemy. Probably it was Caroticus, so a slightly variation of the name, but probably the same one I mentioned earlier. And that Patrick was so angry with him, you know what he did to him? That he supposedly turned him into a fox. One of the worst things I suppose you could be turned into, but I don't believe that Patrick had the power to turn anyone into a fox. Here's another story that was made up about him. Again, I don't believe it's true. It's portrayed him as a kind of superhuman person. That Patrick was even able to coerce God into doing what he wanted him to do. A famous story is told how Patrick was up on Croagh Patrick in County Mayo, and he was there for 40 days and 40 nights, and he was fasting. And we were told he was fasting to try and coerce God to do what he wanted him to do. What did Patrick want God to do? Patrick wanted to be able to save a certain number of people by his own name and his own authority. And that's not the case at all, but that's the way the story goes. Anyway, he was fasting, trying to persuade God to do this. He was interacting with an angel. And supposedly, here's how crazy the story becomes, supposedly God sent some blackbirds to disturb Patrick and tried to stop him from fasting and praying. How did Patrick supposedly respond? Patrick began to sing cursing psalms toward the birds, and he tried to scare them off. It wasn't very effective. So Patrick got his bell, and he rang the bell so loudly, supposedly, that everyone in Ireland could hear it. And this scared the birds off. And the story goes on, and in the end, even God apparently has to give in to Patrick. But that's not an accurate way. Patrick would never have thought that. Patrick recognized that everything was a gift, and he would not be able to force God's hand. So there are all kinds of these stories about Patrick that were told and retold, and they became exaggerated. To find out about the real Patrick, you have to read his own writings, especially his confession.
They got to be an old man.
Again, the legend, if you believe the earliest biographers, it said that he died at Saul, near Downpatrick. If you're down that way in town, and this may be accurate, he did die there, but it's told that he lived to 120. 120. I think that highly unlikely, given the life expectancy of that time period. But again, it's a way of sort of exaggerating him as a kind of superhuman being, that he lived far beyond the normal stage, and he lived 120 years of age and died at a place Saul near Downpatrick in County Down. We don't know what age he died at because we can't be absolutely sure when he was born. Any more? Sorry?
Do we know where he's buried?
Well, it's said, as could well be true, that he's buried near Downpatrick, where he died there in a place called Saul, Saul. I have never been there now. Maybe have any ever been there? Yeah, there's a marker there to him. So that's possible. It's possible that he is buried there.
Beside the Church of Ireland.
Yes, beside the Church of Ireland there. Yeah.
Thank you
hand
very
over
much,
Stephen.
Raymond,
Okay.
for a very interesting and informative talk. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Just two things to let you know. There is a table here at the side with some free literature. There's a little leaflet about Patrick, free at last. There are Gospels of Mark, and then there's a little information leaflet about our church. The meeting this evening was run by Convoy Covenanter Church. As Raymond said, just a couple of 100 yards down the road beside the bridge. If any of you are looking for a church to go to on a Sunday at 11 o'clock, you'd be very welcome. The leaflet also says we have a ladies' night. It's on once a month. The next meeting will be Thursday coming. And we have Bible studies on Wednesday nights as well in our home. They're off during the school holidays, but most other Wednesday nights they're on. But feel free to take any of the things on the table. They're all free. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, please stay and take a cup of tea.